Chapter 12, Going for Help. In the early light of the following morning, the scene was quite different. To begin with, the flood was not quite as high, for the burst pond was empty now and it had not rained in the night. The water had receded far enough to show the gaping hole where the old oak used to stand, but it was still running very wide and very strong, and there was no sign of the outline of the brook. The other difference was one of color. The hilltops around showed brilliantly green in the light of the early morning sun, but what there was to see of Rest Haven was black brown, and milling on it were black brown creatures, the pigs. Pedigree, Gloucester, old spots they might be, but no one would have known, for the herd had rooted and routed over every square inch of ground, looking for something, anything to eat, and they were plastered with mud. As the pigman had said, there was no problem about drinking, for millions and millions of gallons of water flowed by them. It was food they were thinking about, and the first thing they had done was to graze off every blade of grass and gobble up every nettle, every thistle, every leaf and shoot they could reach through the boundary pig wire they had torn off. And where a hedgerow tree was close enough, they had chewed its bark. Then they had turned up the whole top triangle of the field and ferreted out the roots of every blade of grass, every patch of clover, every weed. Anything they came across went down them. Worms, slugs, beetles, even some families of field mice, babies and all. And of all the hundreds of ant heaps that had dotted the upper slopes of Rest Haven, only one remained, and on it, yellow against the black-brown background, the pigman still sat, head hanging, shoulders bowed, stomach rumbling with hunger. Mrs. Barleylove and Daggy Dogfoot were just as black and filthy as the rest, for they too had been rooting everywhere for food. Only Felicity the duck was spotlessly clean, not a black or a white feather out of place, for she had, of course, had flown onto the flood for a thorough bath. She stood now on Mrs. Barleylove's broad back to be out of the way of the pushing, shoving, squealing multitude of earth-covered pigs, and spoke into the big droopy ear, softly so as not to be overheard. "Look, madam," she said, "we've got to do something. You know that as well as I do. This crowd's so hungry, they're eating anything now. Let one little piglet get walked on and they'll gobble him up, and then they'll start on another. I'm right, don't you think?" Mrs. Barleylove shuddered. She knew how every pig worships food, and she was well aware, though she didn't know the word, that pigs are omnivorous, eating everything that is remotely edible. She remembered stories that her mother had told her of swill feeding in the old days, when rats and sometimes cats would fall into the food tubs and get cooked. The pigs would chop them up quite happily, her mother had said. "Course you're right, my dear," she said quietly. "We've got to get help. We've got to go get food. But how? It doesn't look like the servant can swim, or he'd have gone. And your going wouldn't do much good, if you'll excuse me. People wouldn't connect with a duck, with a herd of pigs. The only one that can swim, after all, is—" She stopped, and her mouth fell open. "Oh, no!" cried Mrs. Barleylove. "Oh, no, not him." "It's got to be your Daggy," said Felicity the duck. "If nobody goes, and no one comes to find you all, and the floods don't go down for a week, say, all hell will break loose here." "But he may be drowned," wailed Mrs. Barleylove. "I don't think so," said Felicity, "though I admit it's a possibility. As against the probability," she said very slowly and clearly, "that if he stays here, he'll be eaten." There was a small silence between them in the middle of the uproar of empty-bellied pigs. "All right," grunted Mrs. Barleylove at last. "If he's willing, bless his little heart. and she blinked her white-lashed eyes very quickly. "But you'll go with him, dear, won't you? Please?" "Of course," said Felicity. "Try not to worry, madam. I'm sure it'll all have a happy ending. If we can find some other servants like Pigman, somewhere downstream, they'll see Daggie's spots, and they'll know where he's from. After all, there's only this one herd of Gloucester old spots in the district, isn't there?" "Far as I know," said Mrs. Barley Love. "Well then," said the duck, "they'll know something's wrong, and they'll get food here somehow, by boat or helicopter." The sow had no notion what a helicopter was, but she had a lot of faith in Felicity, and she called loudly to her son. Daggy came running. He was very hungry, for his mother's milk had dried up now, and he had been pushed and shoved away from anything that looked like food by his stronger brothers. But his eyes were bright, and his courage was high, and as soon as he heard about the plan, he was wild to go. Felicity flew down to the water's edge, and Mrs. Barley Love followed, barging her way through the press of pigs, with Daggy at her heels. Coming through, she shouted, and the other pigs, hearing her voice, pushed forward to see what was happening. They were all asking questions at once when sharp squeals from above made them look around. They saw the squire come rolling down toward them, his tusks showing white in his muddy face as he tossed pig after pig out of his way. "What's going on?" he asked in his deep voice when he reached the sows. "Mrs. Barley Love, dear lady, what's going on?" "It's my son, squire," replied Mrs. Barley Love proudly. "He's going for help. He's going to swim for help, to find someone to bring us food." Those nearest to her heard her words, and as the news spread, the herd fell silent, and every head was turned to listen. "Your son?" said the squire loudly. "Your son?" "Our son, squire," said Mrs. Barley Love softly, feeling her white parts turn pink and thankful for the mud that hid them. "That's better," said the squire, and turning to the little piglet, he looked curiously at him. "Little shrimp," he thought, "he's not much bigger than a rat. And those front feet." He spoke quietly now, so that the pigs at the edge of the crowd raised their heads to hear better as the great boar looked down at the little pig. "So you're Daggy Dogfoot," said the squire. "Yes, sir," said Daggy politely. "And you're going for help?" "Yes, sir." "Current's strong, you know. Water's deep. Understand you canner. Swim pretty well, but it'll be dangerous." "Oh, I'll be all right," said Daggy. "Thank you, father," he added daringly. The boar cleared his throat as though there were some kind of lump in it. "Well, good luck, my son," he said in a loud, strained voice. "By St. Anthony, I wish you the very best of good luck." And the mob of pigs echoed him. "Good luck! Good luck!" they cried, and the pigman got up off his ant-heap at the noise and lumbered down to find out what it was all about. He was just in time to see Daggy walk out into the shallows, the mud on him dissolving as the current began to wash him clean. Soon he was swimming, once again a white piglet with black spots, and then he was in midstream, and the full force of the flood water took him and whirled him away. But every pig could see how beautifully he swam, and most of them could hear his farewell cry. One of them stood alone, belly deep in the shallows, while a great tear ran down each of her fat cheeks and plopped into the stream. "Come back safely, my Daggy," said Mrs. Barley Love to herself. Just then Felicity the duck came flying back, low over the heads of the pigs. The pigman had taken off his hat, the better to scratch his head in his utter bewilderment at the sight of a swimming pig. And Felicity dived down, caught it in her clawed feet, and tore it from him. "I'll take this hat with me," she shouted to Mrs. Barley Love as she wheeled to follow Daggy. "Maybe someone will know who this hat belongs to." And she flew rapidly away, the yellow hat dangling below her, while the pigman danced in anger. "Drat yer," he cried, "and dang yer, and blast yer," shaking his huge fist at the two fast disappearing figures. "Stupid, ignorant duck," he shouted. "You and that horrible little dag, you make a fine pair. Never be no use to no one, not neither of you nohow." And as the pigs ran to the topmost part of Rest Haven, they caught a final glimpse of Daggy Dogfoot far down on the flood. They could see Felicity for a little while longer as she flew low, directly above the swimmer, and then there was nothing to be seen but a great waste of waters. Chapter 13. Man on a Raft. Jumping around in anger had awakened the pigman's brain from the days of hopelessness into which it had fallen, and he began to think what he could do about the situation. It occurred to him, as it had to the duck much earlier, that there would be trouble with a capital T if the pigs remained unfed. His shed, he knew, was gone, and help, if it ever came, might be a long time arriving. After much head-scratching, a simple idea came to him. Rest Haven, after all, was only one side of the little cone-shaped hill on which they were marooned, so that there must be grass and bushes and trees on the other side. All he had to do was take down the pig wire that confined his herd, and then they could find something to keep them going. To do this was not easy, since the fence had been well made in the first place, tightly stretched and nailed to posts. Wire cutters would have done the job in a minute, but of course he had none with him. As he stood and looked at the fence, the squire rolled up and stood beside him. They conversed in their separate languages. "If only you had the brains, old fellow," said the pig man, "you'd get your head under the wire and lift it up." "If you had any sense at all, pig man," said the squire, "you'd use that branch that's lying there as a lever to get the bottom of this wire up far enough for me to put my head under it." "If I had something for a lever," said the pig man, "I might be able to lift the bottom of it a little. Then perhaps this old boar would see what I'm getting at." "Man's a fool," said the squire. "Oh, there's a branch," said the pig man. "That might do." "At last," said the squire with a sigh, as the pig man slid the branch under the lowest but one strand of the wire, stuck the far end into the ground beyond, and began to heave upward. With great effort, he managed to lift the bottom strand 6 inches above the ground. "Ladies," shouted the squire, "I want you all on parade, please. Chop, chop." And when the 9 sows came galloping up, he said more quietly, "Spread out, please. 4 on one side of me, 5 on the other. Snouts down. Wait for my word." And from the corner of his mouth he snarled at the servant, "Come on, man." Almost as though he could understand, the pig man redoubled his efforts. The bottom of the wire rose a fraction higher. The boar got his head under the lowest wire, then the sow on either side of him, and so on, until all 10 heads were under and all 10 great bodies tensed. "Ready, steady, heave," shouted the squire, and with a twanging, tearing noise, a 20-foot stretch of pig wire rose up, 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 till the retaining fence post popped out of the ground. "Forward!" bawled the squire, and before the advancing weight of more than 4,000 pounds of pig, the fence burst like a rotten tennis net, and the rest of the herd poured through. They ran around the back of the hill, snatching at the fresh grass like mad things, and the pig man was left alone. The sight of his animals eating again reminded him painfully of how empty his own stomach was. "If only I had a boat," he thought, and he strained his little eyes upstream as though wishing would make one appear. He did not see one, of course, but he did see something. 2 things, in fact. They were about 10 feet apart, halfway between him and his drowned buildings, and he suddenly realized that they were the tops of the gate posts at the entrance to New Haven. Gate posts, he thought. Water must have gone down a little. Couldn't see them before. Gate posts, he thought. There's a gate between them. Gate, he thought, made of wood. Wood, he thought, Floats, floats, he thought, like a boat, well, like a raft. He went down to the water's edge and began to wade back toward the gate posts. The current was strong, but the pig man was powerful, and he fought his way along deeper and deeper as he went down the slope. He was shoulder deep when at last he stood between the posts and, feeling underwater, found the wooden gate. Now was the moment of decision for the pig man. As Mrs. Barley-Love had guessed, he could not swim. Moreover, he was afraid of the water. As a child, he had once been taken to the beach on a school outing, but nothing would persuade him to go beyond the ripples. What he was doing now was, for him, an act of great bravery, but more was needed. In order to grip the heavy gate and clear it from the gate post, he would need, at this depth, to put his head under the dreaded water. And if he lifted it free, would it bear him up? And if it bore him up, where to? To food and shelter and help, or out to the endless ocean? Desperate men do desperate things, and Pigman closed his eyes, settled his feet firmly, and took a good grip and a deep, deep breath. There followed a scene that would have seemed pure comedy if there had been a human watcher unaware of the underlying drama. But for the pigman, it could easily have been one of tragedy. To begin with, the hinges on the gate were jammed on the gateposts, and it took it 3 increasingly breathless dips below the water before his utmost efforts could lift the gate free. And when it was free, the current immediately dragged it away, so that the pigman had to make a wild, belly-flopping leap at it as it went. He caught the back of it, whereupon it tipped up like a live thing, threatening to throw him off into deeper water. Somehow, gasping, spluttering, panic-stricken, he managed to scramble farther onto it, expecting all the time that it would submerge beneath him. But it held him up, though the weight of the heavy man and his waterlogged clothes pushed it below the surface, so that he would have appeared, if there had been a watcher, to be floating motionless on the flood like a bright yellow hippopotamus. This was what he looked like to the first eyes that did see him. Most of the herd were on the reverse side of the hill, rooting and tearing at anything they could find to eat. But the squire and Mrs. Barley-Love had not moved far from the break in their fence, and it was they who witnessed the pigman's progress. "By St. Anthony," the squire pig burst out, "it's the servant. Seems to be lying on top of the water. Extraordinary. Fellow can't be as stupid as I thought." Mrs. Barley-Love watched as the current bore the pigman steadily away. "Daggy," she thought, "where are you, darling?" "I'll be on the lookout," said the squire, reading her thoughts, "when the water level drops a bit more, so I can see the line of the hedges or fences. Should be easy to bust them." "Easier with 2, squire," said Mrs. Barley-Love. Champion Imperial Challenger III of Plowborough raised his heavy head and gazed at this wife of his with approval and affection. "Couldn't wish for a better partner," he said, "and try not to worry too much about the boy. We'll find him. You'll see."